welcome you to another presentation of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. And tonight we are extremely honored to have the one and only Mitch Horowitz. This man really needs no introduction. He is a prolific author, author in residence at the New York Public Library, lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Society in Los Angeles, which we should all be familiar with, founded by Manly P. Hall. He's made multiple television appearances, documentaries, you name it. Mitch is all over the place. I mean, I just don't know how he finds enough time to do all the things that he does. But Mitch has been a friend of the Masons for a long time. He has probably forgotten more about Freemasonry than most Freemasons will ever know. And it's just such an honor, Mitch, to have you here tonight, and especially be talking about one of my heroes, Manly P. Hall. This is going to be phenomenal. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, and the floor is yours, my man.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you for organizing this evening. Thanks to the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. I recognize the names of a number of you who are with us tonight. It's such a pleasure for me to be able to have this exchange with you, and it truly is an exchange because we get together as a community. We get together as a community of students, of seekers, and at the end of the day, that's what it all comes down to. I've always said that my writing, my work, whatever it is I may find myself doing is synonymous with my search. And I'm a seeker, and we join together this evening and other evenings in digital forums, live forums, as a community of seekers. Tonight's topic is very special to me, of course, as it is for many of you. It's about Manly P. Hall and the secret teachings of all ages. I'm writing a book right now, which is going to be coming out in the fall, called The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages, which I'm actually reading in galleys right at this moment. And I hope during the course of this evening together to be able to also provide you with a preview of what I'm writing about in that book. But I'd like to start this evening with a small ritual that actually echoes something that Manly Hall practiced each week, every Sunday, for many years, prior to delivering his talks at the auditorium at the Philosophical Research Society, the beautiful, beautiful campus that he founded and constructed in Los Angeles beginning in 1934. For many decades, as some of you know, Manly delivered talks in the auditorium of the campus, which was built in 1959, until his death in 1990. And I have it on personal knowledge that prior to stepping out of his office on Sunday mornings and stepping into the auditorium, Manly used to approach the altar that's in his office, an altar that is still there, on which he had a little statuette of the Egyptian cat god of Bastet, of which I have a model right here. And this was given to me in Egypt, where I was shooting a documentary, which I'll say a word about, in February of 2019. And I'm going to be wrapping up that documentary with another shoot here in New York City next week. It's about the occult book, The Kabbalion, which was published in 1908, and which is a sounding of some themes from Hermetic philosophy, which is a late ancient Greek Egyptian philosophy. It figures very deeply into the secret teachings of all ages, and I'll be saying something about that. But Manly, to continue with this story and ritual, used to approach his altar each Sunday morning just before preparing to speak. And he would take from the altar the statuette of the Egyptian cat god Bastet, and he would rub the statue. He would rub the head of the cat, because cats are mythically and in actuality said to be able to see in the dark, and that if you can associate with the powers and the abilities of Bastet, or the kind of archetypal figure of a cat, you gain the power of sight. And I value and I love rituals like that, if for no other reason than they allow us to approach our material with a sense of humility. I've said before, the last thing I ever want to do as hear myself delivering some sort of a stump speech or some sort of a regular talk. I think each time we get together, just as each time we have exchanges with one another, ask questions of one another, there should be a freshness to it. And I like the fact that Manly P. Hall, even though he spent decades studying and amassing knowledge in the area of esoteric wisdom, the various religions and initiatory traditions of the world, he always reminded himself before each talk that he was still in need of insight. And insight is what Manly has given to so many generations of seekers ever since he published his great work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, in 1928, when he was just 27 years old. I have a replica edition here with me of the 1928 original of The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I can barely even fit it within the camera. It's not just a coffee table book. I mean, it's the dimensions itself of a coffee table. And for those of you who have read this book or been through it in various ways, you know that splendor and majesty, its incredible range of subject matter, covering the origins of the ancient faiths of the world, the Vedic faiths, the Persian faiths, the Judeo-Christian Muslim faiths, the wisdom traditions of the Native Americans, esoteric traditions ranging from Polynesia to Siberia, Pythagorean mathematics, the question of Atlantis and other primeval civilizations, the philosophy of Hermeticism, the uses of codes and cryptograms, the origins of the tarot images, and so forth. I'm barely naming a sliver of the topics that Manly examined in The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And I want to say to you tonight, at the top of our time together, and I want to say this in a very personal way, that although The Secret Teachings is an extraordinary encyclopedia arcana, although it is an epic compendium of esoteric and occult wisdom, such as none that has reached us in modern life, probably none that has ever existed in the world, it's also, I believe, a very personal book. It's a book in which you can really find yourself. It's a book that I encourage you to read, to reread, to visit, to revisit, in whatever form or edition, because it's not only an encyclopedic work, it's not only a codex, it's not only a catalog of the great esoteric traditions of the world, but it's really a book, I believe, in which you can find yourself. It's a book in which I found myself. There's such a vastness of subject matter in the book that there's a great likelihood that in approaching The Secret Teachings, you may come across that one illustration, that one caption, that one topic, that one parable, that one story that suddenly says to you, this is a scent trail of where I want to go in life. This is what I want to study. This is what I want to dedicate myself to. I first learned about The Secret Teachings of All Ages probably in the late 1990s, at a time when I felt somewhat lost in life. I wasn't quite sure about my purpose, my career as a publisher. I hadn't yet really discovered or found my direction as a writer. And I was having lunch with a couple of friends in New York City. And I was just really at the beginning of my journey into the esoteric. And I asked myself, and I asked my friends at the table, who should I be reading? What should I be studying? And one of them, whose name was Pythia, the same name given to the oracle at Delphi, said the words Manly P. Hall. And she lingered over every syllable. And I thought to myself, who is behind that stately name? Manly P. Hall. I had to know who that was. I'm sure you've all had that experience where you come across a name or an idea or an image and you say to yourself, there's something magnetic in that. There's something in that that I must follow. And I urge you always to listen to that, never to ignore that, never to push it off and and say, I'll get to it later. As soon as I was done having lunch with my friends, this was the early days of digital culture still, I went online and I got a copy, a hardback copy, a smaller edition than the one I was just holding up, of The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And I just fell completely into it. And I think it was the first book I ever encountered that gave me the sense that the documentation of esoteric history could be a vocation in and of itself, and that the seriousness that one brings to that vocation depends not on the choice of subjects, but on the quality of treatment. The quality of treatment that Manly brought to this material was so complete, was so beautiful, was so wonderful, that it gave me a sense of what I wanted to do with my life, which was to document metaphysical experience in history and practice. It gave me that sense. And I also came to the idea, which I was able to act upon just a few years later, that the book should appear in a more accessible edition than the enormous and very expensive tome that it had been published in and republished in over the course of many, many decades. And I had the idea of creating a so-called reader's edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, in which I would take the unabridged text, the complete text, create a slight abridgment of the images, and package it in the size of a regular trade paperback so that it would be accessible and available to everyone. And the president of PRS at the time, Obadiah Harris, a man who opened many doors for me, got together with me in Los Angeles, and I presented this idea to him, and he agreed to it. And in 2003, I was able to publish this reader's edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which some of you may have. And I personally felt just so enlivened and grateful and enthusiastic to be able to do this, because it didn't in any way replace the original. Nothing could possibly replace the original, but it provided a kind of adjunct that would allow people to go into The Secret Teachings of All Ages and just experience it as you might a regular trade paperback, just very easily and effortlessly turning the pages. And one of the things that I discovered in producing that so-called reader's edition was the enormous accessibility of the book. You know, you look at The Secret Teachings of All Ages as a volume, and it's easy to think to yourself, wow, I don't know where to enter. You know, these minutely sized captions and complex charts and endless references and a bibliography totaling over 1,000 works and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of indices and so on and so forth. And it can feel intimidating. And yet at the same time, when you just start turning those pages, you'll see that not only is the book an immaculate collection of esoteric wisdom, but it is enormously readable. It is enormously accessible. And this often begs the question of how Manly P. Hall, at so young an age, he was 27 when he published it, and a man with very, very little formal education, was capable of this accomplishment. And that's something worth considering for a moment. Manly was born in 1901 in Peterborough, which is a kind of what was then certainly a rural city in Ontario, in Canada. And his parents divorced very, very soon after Manly was born. His father disappeared from the scene, and his mother was an interesting woman, a chiropractor, very kind of unusual, self-determined woman at the end of the Victorian era. And for whatever reasons, and he was never very personally disclosing about any of this, she felt she was unable to raise him. She, as a single mother, was unable to raise him. So he was actually raised by his grandmother. And his grandmother took Manly to live in the American West, where they had some relatives. He lived in the Dakotas, and they bopped around different parts of the West. This being the early 20th century, it was possible to kind of exist somewhat under the radar, compared to what we know today, at least. And he really never had any formal schooling. His mother took him on trips to museums in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, where he began to assemble a kind of self-educated background. He was very often sick as a kid. He was bedridden a lot of the time, so he had a great deal of time for reading and for study. It was a lonely childhood. It was not, I would surmise, a happy childhood. Again, Manly would not speak very directly about these things. He grew up at the end of the Victorian age, the beginning of the so-called Edwardian age, and people didn't talk very much about their backgrounds, their emotions, the circumstances of their childhood, at least not in the raw emotional terms that we've grown accustomed to nowadays. But he did make it clear that he didn't feel as if he had much in the way of guidance or moorings to hang on to in life. His grandmother was elderly and herself widowed at that time. He wasn't enrolled in any school. They kind of bopped around in the West, and as I said, would take occasional trips to cultural institutions and museums. And it wasn't until Manly was about 15 years old and his grandmother decided that he needed some kind of formal schooling that she enrolled him in a military academy here in New York City, where I live. And he was in this military academy, probably mercifully, for only about 9 months or so. And he left around age 16. And during that year, his grandmother died. And here was this kid who had had very little schooling, who found himself alone in New York City at age 16. And he did what a lot of people did at that time. He just found work. He was able to find work as a clerk in some brokerage houses. And he kind of bopped around Wall Street, experimented with the idea of becoming a banker. But it never really materialized. It wasn't really for him. And when he was nearing age 18, he decided that he was going to leave New York and travel to Southern California, where his mother was still living. And he arrived in Southern California around age 18. And that was an exciting time in the sense that it was just immediately following the First World War. And California was experiencing these enormous boom times. The place was growing economically. The impact of the movie industry wasn't quite felt just yet. It was still an agricultural town, but there were immigrants who were flowing to California. There were people who were flowing there for reasons of health. It was believed that the Pacific climate, the desert climate, could be a cure for asthma, tuberculosis. That was considered to be like a physical tonic associated with living in the sunshine of California. The railroad industry was there. The oil industry was there. Agriculture was there. The place was growing. And whenever there are population shifts, whenever there are flows of migrants in American life, that's where the new religious movements always crop up. That's something I explore in my book, Occult America. If you look at population flows, whether it be to central New York State just after the War of Independence, whether it be to California during the gold rush, and then even more after the First World War, wherever those mass population flows occur, you've got groups of people who are leaving behind the congregations and the ties of their youth or their families back home, and they are a ripe constituency for new ideas. So California became the launch pad of new ideas, especially new religious ideas. And different groups popped up there, the Theosophical Society, different Rosicrucian fellowships, different esoteric organizations and libraries, New Thought churches, metaphysical churches, and so on. And Manly started to find his way very quickly into some of these esoteric organizations. He was involved in the Rosicrucian Fellowship, an organization founded by a man named Max Heindel. He was involved in the Theosophical Society. These places had libraries where he could kind of continue the self-education that his grandmother had begun with him. And he developed a very quick interest in religious and esoteric philosophies. He was looking for practical philosophies that would help give him a sense of direction in life. You know, he really had a lack of parentage. His father disappeared just when he was born. His mother, for whatever reasons, felt that she could not raise him. You can imagine that leaves a certain psychical scar in a person. And a person feels that, a person carries that through life, no matter how stoic an exterior they may present. And his grandmother raised him, lonely existence, no schooling, very few friends, bedridden. She dies when he's 16. So this is a kid who's saying to himself, I need a philosophy, I need a set of practical ideas that are going to get me through life. Many of you have been there. Many of you have experienced that. I mean, I know when I was 13 years old, 14 years old, I felt my adolescent home coming apart around me. We were suffering financial disaster. My parents got divorced. I was living in a strange, very alien neighborhood that I didn't like. And that moved me at that age into studying esoteric and religious philosophy. William Blake made the observation, opposition is true friendship. Opposition is true friendship. What does that mean? You know, among its meanings are that those circumstances that life throws us in that are difficult, that push us up against a wall, whenever we face barriers, those are goads to growth. Without friction, there would be no growth. We would remain intellectual and emotional children. Who would we be if we didn't have friction in life? The traits that you most value in yourself today are probably traits that were formulated during periods of opposition. So it's a funny thing, you know, sometimes we engage in these fantasies. We ask ourselves, if I could go back and reverse something painful in my past, what would it be? If I could go back and dispense some sort of advice to a younger version of myself, what would that advice be? My counsel is be very careful with that. Be very careful with that. Another night we'll speak about the metaphysical dimensions of the mind and the illusory nature of time. But suffice to say that maybe these fantasies that we have are not just mental exercises. Maybe they're not just novelties. Maybe they actually do make a concrete difference in life. In fact, if linear time is illusory, and again, topic for another evening, it could be that when we think about giving advice to a former self, a younger self, perhaps we're doing that all the time. Perhaps we experience a renewed sense of past, present, and future every moment. Perhaps every perception carries with it this multidimensional sense of orientation, of feeling that, well, you know, of course my life is this linear, orderly affair, but we don't really know that. It could be that we experience linearity as an illusion, a very necessary illusion, by which we get through life. But it could be that we're reliving all of life at once, all the time. Hence, we must be careful, I think, when we talk about removing barriers, reliving the past, giving advice to a younger self. I'm not saying that good can't come out of that. It certainly could. But be careful, because if opposition is true friendship, then it stands to reason the traits that you most admire in yourself today, and rightly so, are traits that grew in response to difficulty. If Manly P. Hall hadn't felt childhood abandonment, hadn't experienced the death of his grandmother at age 16, obviously a tragic time, he wouldn't have gone on a search. He wouldn't have felt the need to locate himself within the world of practical spirituality, esoteric philosophy. He wouldn't have felt that same burning need to seek ethical guardrails as he did. But he did feel that need. He did feel that need. So by the time he reaches California, he's immersing himself in esoteric philosophy, practical philosophy, the religions of the world, parabolic and mythological traditions, anywhere where he can get a sense of meaning and moorings and purpose. And he decides around age 18, 19, that he's going to deliver his first public talk. He has a facility for public speaking. And so at about age 19, in an empty room above a bank building in Santa Monica, Manly delivers a talk on the theme of reincarnation. And a small group of people attend. He and a friend take a little financial offering at the door. It amounted to 35 cents, as he recalled. Talk goes well. Later on, he and the friend go across the street. They get ice cream sundaes. He remembered it as one of the happiest days of his life. He felt, and I want you to listen to this very, very, very carefully because it holds a lesson for you. He felt a sense of what he should be doing in life. There wasn't a heaviness about any of this. There wasn't a grimness about any of this. You know, here he was just on the cusp of the 1920s. This is now maybe around 1919 or so. You know, he's giving this talk on reincarnation above a bank building in Santa Monica. Goes well. He and the friend collect 35 cents. They go get their ice cream sundaes across the street. It's a wonderful day because he's doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. You know, he has found and followed the scent trail of his aim, his purpose in life. That's why I say to you that when you're reading the Secret Teachings of All Ages, this kind of vast compendium of esoteric wisdom, pay attention to topics, illustrations, parables, stories, philosophies that might attract you, because you could yourself be coming upon the scent trail, the exact thing that you're looking for. So Manly quickly developed a reputation as a kind of boy wonder of esoterica. He not only had a powerful and natural speaking style, but he had presence, he had physical presence. He was a large, almost hulking figure. He wore his hair long. He had a very angular face, heavily lidded eyes. He looked a bit like a movie star. He had an impressive, formidable appearance. And by age 20, he became a pastor at a liberal evangelical congregation in Los Angeles called the Church of the People. And Manly would deliver talks, sermons, homilies every Sunday at the Church of the People. And he would very often talk about how religion and ancient philosophy could solve the problems of depression, purposelessness, delinquency, joblessness, crime in the present day. And, you know, this is a period around 1920. And quite frankly, it can seem kind of quaint to us today because the problems of life seem so intractable, so grave, so serious, so complex. But he was making an effort. He was making an effort to argue that a rediscovery of the ancient wisdom traditions could be the very thing that would address what he felt was the alienation that the industrial worker was experiencing in the early 1920s. And he attracted lots of attention from around town. There were articles about him in the Los Angeles Times and other places. He also attracted benefactors because Los Angeles was a propitious place to live for an artist or a writer in the early 1920s. It was still an agricultural town. It was still an oil town. It was still a railroad town. It was still a town of groves and farming and so forth. The movie industry was building, but it wasn't anywhere near the behemoth that it would come to be even a decade later. It was still in its nascence. And so there were wealthy folk in town who were very interested in investing in the the financial, in the cultural infrastructure of Los Angeles. And when you had young writers like a Manly P. Hall or a Raymond Carver, or spiritual figures like a Jiddu Krishnamurti, or maybe a visiting Aldous Huxley, or you had early movie stars like a Mary Pickford or a Charlie Chaplin, there were a lot of people who wanted to know these folks, who wanted to invite them to their garden parties, who wanted to, have them out for picnics. There were rich folk, powerful folk, railroad magnates who wanted to build up the academic and cultural foundations of this former cow town that was suddenly turning into a big, formidable city. And there was Manly P. Hall, this mysterious, hulking, long-haired, well-spoken boy wonder of esoterica and spirituality, who could speak extemporaneously and without notes on the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Beatitudes, Hermeticism, ancient Egypt, reincarnation, eternal recurrence, Kabbalah. Who was this kid? Who was this kid? And so he attracted benefactors, and he was able to travel to different nations early in his 20s. He traveled to Egypt, he traveled to Japan, he traveled to Sri Lanka, he traveled to India. And he went on these world travels, and he sent letters back home. And the interesting thing about the letters he sent back home, many of which I've read, is that they were fairly ordinary. You didn't get a glimpse in these letters, not yet, of the greatness that was to come. They read like fairly ordinary travelogues. We got up today, we did this, we did that, we traveled here, we traveled there. There was very little in the way of profundity or insight. And yet, after Manly returned home in about 1922, he produced his first book, a short book of about 40,000 words called Initiates of the Flame. And Initiates of the Flame, a book that some of you probably know, it's a very short little compact book, but it's also a very rich book, and it's a very beautiful book. And in it, Manly explores the meaning of some of the different symbols of antiquity. The all-seeing eye, the burial spade, the pyramid, the obelisk, the serpent, the eternal flame. Some symbols that are familiar to many of you from Freemasonry. And the book pulsates with a kind of power. It's different. It's of a different quality from the letters that Manly had sent home. And it forms the germination of the secret teachings of all ages. What's extraordinary to me is that only about 6 years passed between Manly's publication of Initiates of the Flame and the appearance of the Secret Teachings of All Ages in 1928, a book that Manly completed when he was just 27 years old. And for a lot of people, that fact is a mystery, a genuine mystery. I've given you a pretty reasonable sketch of Manly's career. I've given you a fairly reasonable explanation of how he got his start, what some of the psychological conflicts probably were in his life, how he began studying esoteric philosophy, his natural abilities as a speaker, his appearance, his ability to attract resources and money in a Los Angeles that was in rapid transformation from an agricultural town to a kind of urban behemoth. I've given you the key forensics, and yet still, for all of us, the mystery lingers. How did this 27-year-old kid with very little formal schooling, and of course, few of the resources that we are accustomed to today, nothing remotely like the digital culture, of course, that we are accustomed to, how did he assemble this magisterial, epic compendium of esoteric wisdom, the secret teachings of all ages. I could give you more details. I could talk to you about how he raised money for the first printing. I could talk to you about the printer he worked with, the artist he worked with, Augustus Knapp, a wonderful artist whose work I really love. But none of those details, I think, would get us to the heart of how Manly accomplished what he did. And of course, there are all these occult theories around Manly's life. You know, there are stories that he was the reincarnation of Plato, or that he had a photographic memory, or that when he died, when he was very young, he experienced death as an infant and was miraculously saved and reborn, and that maybe when he was reborn, some kind of a walk-in spirit entered him, and he was able to accumulate knowledge from other dimensions. I'm unable to verify any of that. You know, how would I? How would I? I'm aware of all of it. But I want to suggest the following to you, and I suggest this not only because I think it's true, but because I think it's useful. And I believe that ultimately Manly P. Hall was dedicated to practical philosophy. For all the esoterica, for all the arcana, for all the codes and ciphers and cryptograms and symbols and all the mysteries that run throughout the secret teachings of all ages, and I love them deeply, the heart of the book is practical philosophy. And Manly believed, as reflected in his early talks at the Church of the People, that philosophy, religion, esoterica should have a practical impact on the life of the individual. It's not just something that is interesting to talk about, to speculate over, to treat like some sort of a museum piece, you know, that belongs to be that should be categorized and put behind a glass case somewhere. Manly believed very deeply that philosophy should be practical. So I want to offer you a proposition that I think might get at the truth of how Manly was able to accomplish what he did, and I hope will also be useful to you in the immediate here and now in your own life. I believe very, very strongly that the closest thing that life grants us to a kind of magic elixir is the discovery of one's absolute aim and purpose in life. It's a discovery that society and circumstance robs from us in a certain sense, because, let's face it, we all have to occupy many different roles, many different demands are placed upon us. We're workers, we're parents, we're artists, we're students, we're soldiers, we're employees, we're caregivers. There's all kinds of demands that society places on us. This is inevitable. And these demands can press upon us so deeply that we are robbed of our capacity to really seek out, search for, and act upon our central key aim in life. I say to you that regardless of the circumstances that may impede the discovery and the acting out of one's key aim, regardless of that, it's vital and it's imperative for your sense as a creative being, as a generative being, as a being who is supposed to be crafted in the image of the Creator, as above, so below, goes the great Hermetic dictum. Or, as Western scripture puts it, God created man in his own image. If you take that seriously, then take seriously the fact that you must search for this key aim, this key purpose in life. You must search for it with just a sense of unembarrassed, unimpeded, unconventional individuality. You don't have to tell anybody what you're doing. You don't have to vet what you're doing through any third party. You don't have to tell your spouse or your shrink or your girlfriend or boyfriend or your neighbor, because that's just another of the ways that society tends to take things from us. We're told that's not realistic, that's not practical. What are you talking about? That's weird. You know, forget all that. We're not here to overturn society, you know. That's another day. It's another evening. We're here to overturn this internalized peer pressure that maybe keeps us from asking and arriving at the question, what do I really want in life? Because I believe that is what produced the greatness that Manly Hall demonstrated in his writing of The Secret Teachings of All Ages. This was a person who found his aim in life, which was to become a great cataloger, a great documentarian of esoteric wisdom. It was his central core purpose in life. And when you discover that central core purpose in life, which is exquisitely and privately yours, it will, I believe, unlock energies and capacities and abilities in you that may be greater than anything you ever perceived as possible. I've experienced this myself. I've observed it in other people, only too rarely. Manly's capacity to produce this magisterial epic work that he did at age 27 was not ordinary. There was an extraordinary quality to it. And while I don't have any definitive answer, the closest and the best I can come up with, and the most practical, is that he discovered at a very, very young age precisely his purpose in life. Precisely his purpose in life. And it unleashed tremendous abilities, potential, and capacities. He also discovered this purpose at a very young age, which I think brought with it great power, but also great challenges and difficulties as well. And I'll speak about that a little bit later. But you know, peaking when you're young can be very powerful because you're filled with vitality and you have years stretched out in front of you. But peaking when you're young can also be burdensome because it can be very difficult to figure out, what is my second act? What is my next act? And I think that figured into Manly Hall's life as well. After The Secret Teachings of All Ages was published in 1928, Manly did many, many great things. And I've written about some of the great things that he did. He founded his campus, PRS, which is extraordinary and quite beautiful. He produced books that were influential books. Secret Destiny of America, a book that influenced Ronald Reagan, among others. Lost Keys of Freemasonry, a whole wide range of different books, lectures, articles. He published some very beautiful magazines, The Phoenix, The All-Seeing Eye. He amassed a collection of esoterica that for many decades was unparalleled, I think, here in the United States. He did many great things. However, I don't think he ever reached that pinnacle of brilliance again. I think that as the decades passed, there could be a certain sameness in what Manly was doing. You know, give another lecture, have it transcribed, you know, produce another book, self-publish it, you know, go on a lecture tour. I think to some degree, as the decades marched on, it may have been difficult for him to find a kind of a second act. I say this because I personally, as a man who loves his work, and I don't think I need to tell you the veneration and the depth of affection and respect I have for this man, but we also have to love one another as adults. I mean, I don't put people up on pedestals, and I don't believe in this idea that there's a realized man and you can't understand what's going on with the realized man, because we're all products of human foibles and we're all products of polarity. Manly had his high moments and Manly had his low moments. Manly wrote some essays and articles that were terrible by today's standards. things that I think were just either based on single sources and sort of shallow, or based on cultural assumptions that sensitive people today in the 21st century would reject, even by the standards of his time, not necessarily by the standards of our own time, which I don't think is fair, you know. But I think that he had blind sides, and I don't buy into the thesis of the great guru, the great teacher, the great man who's sort of infallible or whose motives are inscrutable. I think a lot of times when people try to thrust those identities upon others, they're almost doing so in an act of vanity, as if to say, well, hey, look at me, you know, I'm a student of the great man, which makes me kind of an apostle, doesn't it? You know, there's a certain vanity in the seeker, waxing sycophantic and elevating his or her guru into some sort of infallible status. It's almost like the individual wants that to reflect back onto them as some sort of a satellite that's gleaning sunlight from the great guru or teacher. So I don't really go in for that. I don't go in for that. I think that we're all a polarity, and as great a height as someone scales, he or she also has within their own character equal and opposite foibles. I think that's just one of the prices that life exacts from us. So in peaking young, you know, I think Manly had a sense of directionlessness at times as he got older. And I say this in part because I don't want anybody to feel intimidated by the accomplishment that he or other great figures for that matter have attained. You know, I mean, what he did at the age of 27 was absolutely extraordinary. But I think, again, you know, peaking young can bring with it equal and opposite burdens, particularly the burden of asking, what comes next? What's my second act? And I think that was difficult for him. But I say this to you primarily because I want to underscore what I believe is the importance of finding that absolute aim in life, rather than kind of being too ponderous about how Manly P. Hall was able to accomplish the great things that he did. I would suggest to you that the common denominator in that and in the accomplishments of other people whom we deeply admire is that sense of absolute purpose. And Manly felt, as I said, that philosophy should be meaningful. And one of the key principles that you'll find in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, one of the principles that you'll find in his introduction to the book, is this idea that philosophy is intended above all to help the individual know him or herself. And one of the ways that the individual can know him or herself is through the Hermetic dictum that I was referencing earlier, as above, so below. Most of the esoteric traditions of antiquity, and you'll certainly see this reflected throughout the Secret Teachings of All Ages, taught that there's no difference between you, the individual, ultimately, and the surrounding cosmos, that one is reflective of the other. And in the same way that many of the ancient traditions, certainly this includes ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, many of the Persian traditions, in the same way that many of the ancient traditions held that a great higher mind or universal mind created the cosmos, created humanity, so are we creators within our own sphere. The Greeks used to refer to this great cosmic mind as nous, or Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. Emanuel Swedenborg called it a divine influx. We sometimes use the term infinite mind today. All were circling around the same idea, that there is this one great ultimate intellect of creation. And as this great intellect visualized and propagated all that is, so can you, as above, so below, create within your own sphere of existence. Although our sphere of existence is not quite the same as the highest sphere. This is one of the themes you'll find in Hermetic philosophy, the late ancient Greek Egyptian philosophy, which served to write down into the Greek language many of the great oral traditions and temple teachings of ancient Egypt. This is the philosophy that's associated with the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice greatest Hermes, which was the Greek term of veneration for Thoth, Egypt's god of writing and intellect. And the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, as those of you who read The Secret Teachings of All Ages are aware, figures very prominently into the book. Hermes Trismegistus was mythically considered to be the writer, the scribe, the creator of the Hermetic literature. Hermetic literature, again, was literature that was written in Greek. It was written in the decades immediately following Christ in the city of Alexandria, written during a period of time in which Greek Egyptian scribes were, in essence, writing down in literary form esoteric teachings that had existed probably for centuries upon centuries in ancient Egyptian life. And one of the central ideas of the Hermetic literature, and you'll find that this runs throughout the Secret Teachings of All Ages, is that you too are a creator within the sphere that you occupy. But the sphere that you occupy is not the same as the sphere from which this ultimate mind emanates. We are burdened by physical limitations. These bodies that we occupy will decline and decay. We will die. The psalmist says, ye are as princes, ye are as gods, but ye shall die and fall as princes. So this is something that we wrestle with in contemporary spirituality. Behind me, over my left shoulder, is a wonderful image of the teacher Neville Goddard, a modern mystic who I love, who I have tattooed on my arm. And Neville taught that the human imagination is God. Your imagination is God. That everything you encounter in Scripture is just the blueprint of your own psychological development, and that every time you happen upon the term God or Christ in Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, you're encountering a symbolic representation of your own imagination, which is the ultimate creator. And I love Neville, and I love Neville's philosophy. And yet, we must deal with mortality. We must deal with physical limitation. If you hit a piece of furniture, if you experience, your toe hitting mass, you are going to experience pain. There is virtually no exception to that. None that's really practical to speak of, certainly not in my life. I think Hermetic literature, I think that the Hermetic teachings help harmonize our experience with this ideal of mental creativity. The Hermetic teachings hold, yes, you have mental creativity. Your mind, your images, your emotionalized thoughts, they do create. And with proper preparation and awareness, you can enter greater and greater levels of creativity. The Hermetic literature says that ultimately the human, the individual, in a sense, is greater than the gods, because the gods are already realized, but you, the individual, are in an act of becoming. At the same time, reality, according to Hermeticism, is composed of concentric circles that emanate from the intellect of this one great higher mind. And we occupy a circle, we have no way of knowing how far, but that is situated far from that one perfect, essential circle that connotes nous, or infinite mind, within Hermetic philosophy. But through proper awareness, and possibly through recurrent lifetimes, another issue entirely, we may be able to rise up through those concentric circles. So Hermeticism is a very idealistic philosophy, but it's also a very realistic philosophy. And I think it meets us exactly where we live. And it's just extraordinary because it's this thread of connection. It's this thread of authentic connection that we have to some of our primeval ancestors in ancient Egypt. So much separates us in time and space and geography and perception from what our primeval ancestors were thinking about. And yet, if we assume, as I argue, and I talk about this in various places, including in the Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages, and I think Manly Hall certainly would have agreed with this, if I'm correct that the Hermetic literature, this late ancient literature that was written down in Greek in the decades following Christ, is a kind of retention, is a written form of a much older oral tradition and symbolical tradition that belonged to ancient Egypt, stretching back millennia, then it connects us. It connects us to the thoughts and ideas of some of our most ancient ancestors. And I believe that Manly's chapter on Hermes Trismegistus and on Hermeticism in the Secret Teachings of All Ages is one of the best things he ever wrote. It is a wonderful introduction to Hermetic literature, and it provides some pretty serviceable translations of Hermetic literature. There are some more modern translations that I think are probably better for modern folk. One in particular that I like was written by a man named Brian Copenhaver and was published by Cambridge University Press. There's also a translation of Hermetic literature called The Way of Hermes, which was published by Inner Traditions. And those are two really outstanding translations. But Manly's translations and the background that he provides to them in the Secret Teachings are really serviceable. And I would say that's a terrific start, an absolutely a terrific start. The philosophy of Hermeticism is really, in many respects, the backbone of the Secret Teachings of All Ages. It's referenced and it's referred back to in almost every chapter. You know, the chapter on tarot, for example, talks about the tarot images as being images that were really Renaissance era, or maybe a little earlier than that, Middle Ages interpretations of ideas that were found in aspects of Hermetic literature. So it's really very important, I think, to kind of get your arms around the idea of what Hermetic philosophy is. You know, we hear the term Hermetic all the time. We hear the name Hermes Trismegistus, but the Secret Teachings of All Ages is a wonderful place to begin to get a really, really solid sense of just what Hermetic philosophy is all about, because I think it not only connects us with the ideas of our ancient ancestors, but it helps harmonize, I think, some of the conflicts that we might deal with today, particularly those of us like me, and I'm sure like some of you who are dedicated to New Thought or the work of Neville Goddard or the metaphysics of mental causation, mental creativity. The presence of ancient Egypt and the mystery of ancient Egypt also runs throughout, I would say, just about every chapter of the Secret Teachings of All Ages. Manly ventured a theory in the Secret Teachings of All Ages that the timeline of ancient Egypt is older than we understand. Conventionally speaking, most academics will date the dawn of ancient Egypt to around 3,500 BC. But Manly ventured that ancient Egypt actually was older and went back to maybe 7,500 BC, or at oldest, maybe 10,000 BC. He also posited the existence of Atlantis and other primeval civilizations. But I want to leave that aside. I talk about that in the Seeker's Guide, but I want to set that aside for a moment and just raise a question about the timeline of ancient Egypt. One of the things that I write about in the Seeker's Guide is a fairly modern theory that was arrived at after Manly's death that didn't reference Manly P. Hall, but that did validate, at least in its own suppositions, his predating of the timeline of ancient Egypt. And that was a theory arrived at by the independent Egyptologist John Anthony West, who recently died, and another Egyptologist, Robert M. Schoch, who was a Yale-educated geologist and holds a faculty position today at Boston University. I became friendly with Schoch and West in the 1990s, it must have been, maybe late 1990s, early 2000s. And I was very taken with their ideas. The Schoch-West thesis is as follows. They theorize that there is water damage on the oldest portions of the Great Sphinx on the Giza Plateau. And this water damage is such that it would environmentally predate the construction of that monument several thousand years earlier than the traditional timeline. And what Schoch and West arrived at actually squares with the theory that Manly Hall expounds in the Secret Teachings of All Ages. It also squares with a statement about ancient Egypt that was ventured by the great spiritual philosopher G.I. Gurdjieff in his book, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, in which Gurdjieff also talks about the antiquity of ancient Egypt as extending back to about 10,000 BC rather than 3,500 BC. And in The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages, I do my best to kind of revive the Schoch-West thesis, which hasn't been discussed a great deal recently. It was debated quite hotly in the 1990s, and it's not talked about too much nowadays. The fact is, no mainstream archaeologist, from my perspective, has fully resolved, responded to, or directly addressed the Schoch-West thesis. Robert M. Schoch and John Anthony West, in their on-site research at the Giza Plateau in the 1990s, demonstrated that there is water damage on the oldest portion of the Great Sphinx. And they contend that this water damage suggests ancient Egyptian culture is thousands of years earlier than the ordinary timeline. Now, critics vociferously push back against the Schoch-West thesis, and they say there's no other corroborating events that support this. There may be environmental factors that created this water erosion, but all of the responses to it are indirect. No one has gone, looked at, replicated, and responded to their research, either to disprove it or to support it. And it's actually very difficult to do this because research access to the Great Sphinx at Giza and other Egyptian monuments as well is very tightly proscribed, is very tightly guarded and held. And it's very difficult for many, many reasons to get the funding and the licensure to research these things. And so this question effectively has been allowed to wither, I would say, in our generation. I mentioned earlier that I was in Egypt in February of 2019 with the director Ronnie Thomas to shoot footage for a documentary that Ronnie and I are working on about the occult book, The Kabbalion. And it was absolutely cost prohibitive even to shoot footage at the monuments. We were able to surreptitiously shoot footage, something for which we would have been thrown in jail if we were caught. And now that I'm back home on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, I'm allowed to say this. But the cost and the licensing requirements were just absolutely prohibitive. So we went there and we had to do our work somewhat surreptitiously and under the radar. All the more so difficult is it for credentialed archaeologists to gain access to these monuments. There's a kind of political dimension to the way that monuments and historical sites are treated all over the world today. And this is not particular to Egypt. It exists in every nation all over the world. Most historical sites are under some kind of government control. So usually politics, to some extent, intrudes upon who's allowed into these sites, who's allowed to examine them. And one of the difficulties that's experienced in Egypt today in researching questions like the Shock West thesis is that there is a feeling which I understand, but which I think is perhaps misplaced. There's a feeling that if you study the monuments of ancient Egypt, and if you predate them to an earlier age, an earlier era, there's a feeling within the government and some aspects of Egyptian culture that you are somehow stripping Egypt of its own heritage, of its own lineage, of its own custodianship of the Great Pyramids. And this is probably exacerbated by the so-called ancient astronaut theory, which is not something that I've studied. It's not something I'm a partisan of. You may see me from time to time on Ancient Aliens, but when you do, I'm talking about general subjects. I'm not an ancient alien theorist. I'm not a participant in that. I understand that some Egyptian authorities feel that the whole ancient alien thesis kind of detracts from Egypt's sense of its own national heritage. But I don't think that should be a concern in connection with the Shock West thesis, because what the Shock West thesis is really saying is ancient Egypt was a much older civilization than we have come to understand. We haven't correctly calibrated the timeline. And if we haven't correctly calibrated the timeline, it is possible that humanity's origins, our capacity to form into civilizations, our religious parables, our ideas, our cosmologies are thousands of years older than we have actually understood. And maybe that sheds different light on Plato's dialogues, for example, that touch upon Atlantis. Maybe the idea of there being an Atlantis or some primeval civilization is a parabolic representation of the truth that is indicated in the Shock West thesis, if it's correct. So it's a fascinating question, I think, that has been lost in our generation, but that is hinted at, is suggested in the Secret Teachings of All Ages. Because in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, Manley takes the Atlantean thesis very, very seriously. He views Atlantis as represented in Plato's dialogues as history, not just as parable. He also views ancient Egypt as older than the conventional timeline. After Manley's death in 1990, Shock and West, without reference to Manley, arrived at their own thesis about water erosion on the Sphinx. So is it possible that the Atlantis thesis is a parabolic retelling of the actual timeline of ancient Egypt? We don't know. And there are barriers to these questions. The question itself is indestructible. And my hope would be that maybe in some future generation, there'll be ambitious young graduate students in archaeology who find a way to take this question up again. But for now, it's the Secret Teachings of All Ages, even though it predates the Shock West thesis by many, many decades, is a good way of at least entering into that question. The Secret Teachings of All Ages also offers some interesting insights onto so-called secret societies. You know, people are fascinated nowadays with secret societies, and in many ways they bring really lurid and sensationalistic ideas to the whole question of secret societies. You know, the most popular secret societies that one hears about, historically speaking, are, of course, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Knights Templar as well. I just wrote a new introduction to a book about the Knights Templar going back many years, called The Temple and the Lodge, in which the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail make the case that the Templars, after they were suppressed in the early 1300s, eventually morphed into Freemasonry. And I'm agnostic on that question, although I do think that it is tantalizing and powerful to consider that Freemasonry itself, as Manly P. Hall alludes, is very probably a repository of older ideas than those that are associated with the emergence of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. And that's almost got to be the case. I mean, things don't just fall from the sky. The Hermetic literature didn't just appear filled with these self-generated ideas that occurred to these Greek scribes in the city of Alexandria after the death of Christ. Obviously, they were drawing on much older things. The story of religion, the story of all human knowledge, is adapting, moderating, morphing older ideas into philosophies that we know today, that we call by different names, but that are all standing on the shoulders of older ideas. Why would Freemasonry be any exception to that? And there are many, many powerful and tantalizing possibilities connected to Freemasonry that Manly explores in the Secret Teachings of All Ages. One of the ideas to which I'm most sympathetic and which I think has some real historical weight behind it is the prospect that Freemasonry is a latter variant, or kind of a cousin to the earlier movement of Rosicrucianism, the so-called esoteric brotherhood that began to emerge in Central Europe in the early 1600s. The Rosicrucian manuscripts really shook up Europe and Central Europe in the early 1600s. They were written with the claim that there was this invisible college, this invisible brotherhood called the Rosicrucians, who were vouchkeeping, were safekeeping ancient ideas, ancient symbols, ancient initiatory traditions of development, and that this brotherhood believed in religious equality and believed in social polity, believed in free schools and free hospitals and radical ecumenism and the equality of all people, and that it was kind of announcing its presence as a clandestine force behind society in these early manuscripts. It's not at all clear whether there was actually a Rosicrucian brotherhood, but we possess our manuscripts. We don't really know that there was this lodge. You know, it may have been a small collection of people who came out of the occult revival of the Renaissance. It may have been some followers of the great magician John Dee, who was sent into exile after the death of Queen Elizabeth. We don't really know. But there is a historic confluence of ideas and a timeline of coincidence between Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. After the advent of Rosicrucianism, or at least the Rosicrucian manuscripts in the early 1600s, you begin to get some of the first obvious literary references, journal references to Freemasonry, culminating, at least in my point of view, in the work of an English antiquarian and esotericist named Elias Ashmole, who in his diaries in 1646 made very clear and concrete reference to being inducted into a Freemasonic lodge. And the Ashmole diaries, while they're not the earliest references, are, to my mind, incredibly valuable because they're perhaps the most unambiguous references. Ashmole is very plain and very clear in his diaries of 1646, about a generation after the appearance of the Rosicrucian manuscripts, that he was inducted into an esoteric lodge of Freemasons. And this is decades before the emergence of the Grand Lodge. So it's very tantalizing. And you can read about some of this in the Secret Teachings of All Ages. Manly also understood something that mainstream historians are really only now coming to acknowledge and understand. And that was the real-life prevalence of Freemasonry amidst the revolutionists in the American colonies. And that's real history. And that has been overlooked. And I think it's only in our generation that we're really coming into a full and proper understanding of this. You know, many people know, of course, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were Freemasons. The fact is, there were many central figures of the American Revolution, some of much lesser known names, who were Freemasons. An outsized number of Washington's generals were Freemasons. An outsized number of the framers of the Constitution were Freemasons. An outsized number of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. And I think that we underestimate sometimes how important that really was. The American colonies were just an incredibly rural place. I mean, at the start of the 1700s, for example, the city of Philadelphia was a cluster of maybe 500 houses. I mean, this was a very, very rural, sparsely populated place. And so colonial life, consisted of agriculture, church, some business. There were no hospitals really to speak of. I mean, maybe in Boston, New York, Philly, but that's it. Maybe 3, 4. There were very, very few universities. Nothing that we would really regard as cathedrals. There weren't places of learning. Your life, if you were free at that time, consisted of church, family, farm, maybe your business or your trade, maybe a public house, if you lived in New York or Philly. And that was it. Life was incredibly rural and agriculturally based. So, you have to think of it. You have to consider, imagine what it means for an adult to take an oath to Freemasonry, to take an oath to this esoteric order that uses ancient rites and symbols and ceremony for ethical development, that requires privacy, secrecy among its members. I don't think because of any skullduggery or anything like that. I think because Masonry, particularly in Europe, existed outside the authority of the aristocracy and the church. It wasn't an organization at that time that really functioned within the accepted boundaries of society. So there were very good reasons. For privacy. And the same was true of the organization called the Illuminati, which was founded in Bavaria in 1776 by a lawyer named Adam Weishaupt. And Weishaupt, I consider kind of a renegade Freemason, because Weishaupt's plan was he wanted to take the political program of the Rosicrucians and of the Freemasons, and he wanted to push it to an even more radical degree. He was an anti-monarchist, dedicated to separation of church and state, believer in the individual spiritual search, a reviver of esoteric spiritual traditions. He wanted to bust up the connection between the church and the aristocracy. And he was operating outside the bounds of what was considered legal. I mean, his organization was actually outlawed within about 8 or 9 years of its founding, and it really withered, past that point. We have all these fantasies today about the Illuminati being behind everything. Of course, now the phrase Illuminati is not so popular anymore. It's been replaced by deep state. But we always have these phrases to describe, somebody somewhere is up to something, and none of it ever seems to make, my health insurer behave any better. None of it ever seems to make my wait time, when I'm waiting for the customer service center at my bank to pick up, respond any better. I don't know who's behind that, but it ain't the Illuminati. And, what these organizations really stood for were kind of some of the most radical expressions of the value of the individual, the kind of thing Thomas Paine, for example, was writing about at the time. And they were also composed of people who believed in the esoteric search for meaning, who believed in radical ecumenism, who believed that the search for truth wasn't limited to any one single congregation. And you see evidence of this in the Great Seal on the back of the US dollar bill, that beautiful, mysterious eye and pyramid surrounded by the Latin slogan, Annuit septis novos ordo seclorum. God smiles on our new order of the ages. It's not a symbol directly from Freemasonry, but I think it's fair to say it's inspired by Freemasonry. It's Masonic principles to the core. The pyramid depicts worldly progress, but worldly progress is incomplete without the eye of providence floating above it. Now, that's the reverse of the Great Seal. The obverse is the more familiar American eagle. But that Great Seal was commissioned on an order from the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, and it was designed by a committee chaired by Benjamin Franklin, himself a Freemason, and it was ratified in 1781. It was unfamiliar to much of the American public for generations and generations because it was only used for official business. It wasn't until 1935 that Franklin Roosevelt, himself a Freemason, and Henry Wallace, then his Secretary of Agriculture, but later his Vice President, came up with the idea of placing the iron pyramid on the back of the US dollar bill. God smiles on our new order of the ages. I believe very strongly that that is an enunciation of Masonic philosophy as it existed among some of the core founders. This idea that here is a nation that's part of the chain of great civilizations that is going to protect the individual search for meaning. And I think that's truly the greatest purpose of America. We're going through unbelievable crises right now. We're recalibrating our sense of our national life. And yet, you know, as long as there is a protection of the individual search for meaning, my perspective is that we can make it, because that's the heart of our national purpose. Of course, there's other things going on. There's commerce, there's all kinds of things happening and playing out. There are tremendous crises, there are tremendous needs, but if the individual search for meaning is protected, as I think is exemplified by that magnificent symbol, then we're functioning as a society. And I think Manly Hall had a sense of Masonry's impact on the shaping of America in a deeper and fuller and more profound way than most historians did at that time. And it's only more recently that mainstream history is coming to accept this. You might call it the secret society thesis. Maybe that's putting it a little dramatically, but Manly did believe, I think with some justification, that you had these fraternal orders that valued esoteric teaching, the protection of the search for meaning, the development of the individual, radical ecumenism, and because these were, at that time, dangerous ideas, they were held within the framework of clandestine societies, clandestine fraternities, the most prominent of which was Freemasonry, which I think lived out its fullest ideals, despite all the contradictions, and there were many, and I write about this in The Seeker's Guide and elsewhere. It lived out its fullest ideals in the development, the framing of America's founding documents, the Declaration, the Constitution. And these ideals were at play 100 years before the framing of the Constitution. These things ran through American colonial life, and a lot of that had to do, not all of it, but a lot of that had to do with the influence of Freemasonry. So these are some of the insights that Manly P. Hall had. I want to say a quick word, because I want to leave us time for exchange and questions. I want to say a quick word about the end of Manly Hall's life, which is something that's been the subject of a lot of rumor and speculation and some degree of sensationalism. Towards the end of his life, I think Manly felt a sense of anxiety that his ideas would be forgotten, that there wouldn't be people like us getting together today talking about the secret teachings of all ages, that this big, expensive, majestic, and an ornately produced book would fall out of readership, would fall out of circulation, that he would no longer be known, that his books wouldn't be read, his speeches wouldn't be heard, his voice would be stilled with death. And I think this made him vulnerable. And his vulnerability was seized upon by a pair of con artists, a father-son pair of con artists, who managed to insert and ingratiate themselves into Manly's world, into Manly's life, when he was very aged, overweight, unhealthy. And to make a long and sad story relatively short, one of this pair of con artists managed to get Manly to sign over his will to him and give him power of attorney over his finances just about a couple of days prior to Manly's death. And when Manly died in 1990, the circumstances of his death were considered suspicious. His body had been moved from inside to outside. An inordinate amount of time passed until his death was reported to medical authorities. Manly's widow believed that these two kind of rogue executors murdered Manly, and the Los Angeles Police Department for about 5 years had a homicide file open on Manly's case. A couple of years after his burial, his body was exhumed for a second autopsy. The file is now closed, and I review the details in Occult America. I won't go into them in any substantial way here, but I don't believe that Manly Hall was murdered. I don't believe that Manly Hall was the victim of homicide. I do believe he was the victim of what we today might call elder abuse. I do think that this father-son team of con artists, both of whom are now dead, interjected themselves into his life and exercised undue influence over him, and that there were not people around Manly who were able to help him. And in fact, some of the very people who objected to the presence of these guys were actually fired, and people were shocked and couldn't understand how a man who had dedicated his life to imbibing the wisdom traditions of the world seemed so bereft of wisdom at a time when he was most in need of it. My sense is that Manly Hall's intellectual faculties remained strong until the end of his life. He gave a talk which was recorded in the auditorium at PRS just about a week or so before his death, and intellectually he certainly seemed to be in total command of his faculties, and yet he made moves financially and in terms of his workplace and in terms of distancing himself from people who wanted to help him and favoring this father-son team of con artists that proved disastrous. After Manly's death, there was a civic court judge who nullified their power of attorney, who said that they had exercised undue influence over him, that passed no reasonable person's sniff test. They sued PRS, PRS sued them, Manly's widow sued everybody, and legal bills literally mounted into the millions. And although the suits were finally settled, PRS was forced to sell off some of its most treasured antiquities in order to meet the legal bills. And the organization that Manly founded on the basis of wisdom and knowledge and search and education was very nearly decimated and destroyed. So a number of people asked the question, and I asked the question, why did a man who dedicated his life to the search for knowledge seem bereft of knowledge, insight, perspective, judgment at the very time when he most needed it? And it may have something to do with a factor that I was alluding to earlier, which was that Manly peaked when he was very young. And I think he found it difficult to find his sense of a second act. And I think that he had been so successful when he was young at attracting benefactors that he was able to liberate himself from some of the demands of day-to-day life. he had sufficient resources, he had sufficient money, he had sufficient backing so that he was able to assemble this magnificent, really beautiful campus, which of course still exists today. He was able to dedicate his life to reading, writing, speaking, collecting. And seen from a certain perspective, he was living the dream. You know, isn't this something in some various way that all of us want? We want to quit our day job and dedicate ourselves to our art or our search or our pupilhood or whatever it is that we're into. And yet when you do that, there can also be a difficulty to it, a crisis to it, an unseen disadvantage to getting everything that you want. You know, the frictions of life, the difficulties of life, the challenges of life, the economic demands of life, sometimes are the very things that most strengthen us. As I was citing earlier, Blake's wonderful maxim, opposition is true friendship. Manly had reached a point in life where he was able to lower a lot of barriers and eliminate a lot of opposition. But in so doing, in eliminating the demands, the rigor, the friction that economic need or other needs sometimes visit upon us, in eliminating the presence perhaps of other people who might have afflicted him, who might have bothered him, who might have pushed back at him, and his ability to kind of create his own world, his own kind of blessed fiefdom within the structure of this beautiful campus that he created. Ultimately, that might have left him without the people, the collaborators, the resources that he most needed when there were wolves at the door. It's very dangerous, I think, to be surrounded by people who view you as the great man, the great teacher. Because the truth is, very frequently, in atmospheres like that, I believe, personally, the best people ultimately fall away because they don't want to be perennial students, they don't want to be sycophants, they don't want to be support staff or support structure. They might have their own things that they want to build, construct, do. And you don't ever want to be in a situation in life where you're surrounded by people who perhaps just want to venerate you. Maybe you want to be in a situation where there are people who plague you, who tell you no, who cause friction, who push back. Maybe those are the very people that will protect you when there are wolves at the door. Or maybe those are the very people who tone you, who strengthen you in certain ways to protect yourself. And these ways might not become evident or obvious or even necessary until you face a crisis. So that's a closing note in terms of lessons to take from Manly's life. My opening note was identify that thing that is most central to your life. Great strength and great energy will come from that. The bookend to that, the opposite polarity of that, equally true, I think, is once you've made that identification, stay hungry. Stay hungry. Don't pine for things to become too easy. Don't pine for barriers to lower themselves too quickly. Don't wish too hard to have economic advantages and to be able to quit your day job and do all these things that we all naturally dream of doing. Because it could be that those very oppositions, those very frictions are the thing that tone and strengthen you and will help you stand firm when opposition presents itself, maybe in ways that you don't even currently foresee. So I ask you to honor and to celebrate Manly P. Hall as a wonderful scholar, an extraordinary intellect, a man who exceeded the boundaries of the ordinary, who gave us the secret teachings of all ages and other works, and who gave us an example in his own life that allows us not only to discover and imbibe the wisdom of the ages, but that also helps us in that most important inquiry of discovering ourselves. So with that, I thank you so much for being here. And we still have some time remaining. Thank you. And I'd love to open it up to questions, comments. So Matt, please.
Mitch, thank you so much. That was mind-blowing. Really blown away. I mean, I've always been a fan of Manly P. Hall, but I think I'm even more of a fan after tonight. I've always had the impression that Manly was a very humble man. He was an intense person, and you just look at his gaze, look at some pictures, you know, very intense, but he was not one that necessarily wanted to be the center of attention. He was more interested in sharing knowledge and wisdom and making that the center of attention. And I know you've been in his personal office there at the Philosophical Research Society, and my understanding is that it was left pretty much the way it was when he passed away.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you'd like to talk a little bit about, you know, the character of Manly P. Hall, which I think you really did a great job talking about, but his humility.
Well, he lived and he spent most of his life in Los Angeles, and he didn't really go in too much for hobnobbing with movie stars. You know, I always thought that was something that was interesting, you know, about his life. He certainly would have had every door open to him at every mansion, you know, in Beverly Hills or Bel Air or wherever it is that, you know, the fancy folk live. And yet, you know, his friendships were very private. He was friends with the actor Bela Lugosi. They used to listen to opera together, and he officiated at Bela Lugosi's last wedding. He was friends with the folk singer and the actor Burl Ives, who was himself a Freemason. Manly became a Freemason in the 1950s, and they became friendly. But he never really sought out celebrity, and I thought that was always interesting. You know, once in a while he would dabble in the movie business, but not too often. And he signed a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages to Elvis Presley in the early 1970s. But, you know, he never made any attempt to meet Elvis or to, you know, hang around with him. I write about this in The Seeker's Guide. I write about this in various other places. I'm all but certain that Manly met with Ronald Reagan on the campus of PRS, but he wouldn't really talk about it. Reagan was governor at the time. Reagan was in his second term of governor, and Stephen Heller, who was a close friend of Manly. Stephen is a scholar of Gnosticism and great esoteric thinker, scholar in his own right. He and Manly were close, especially in the early 70s. And when Reagan began his political rise to national office, and, you know, he might appear on the news, Stephen said that, you know, Manly might be watching the television, and he would laugh and say, "Oh yes, we know him," but he didn't talk about it too much. And I thought that was really interesting. You know, there was a very serious limit on the degree of social climbing or hobnobbing that he engaged in, and I just thought that said something positive about the man.
Absolutely. So what I'd like to do is just open it up to anyone. You're free to unmute yourself and ask Mitch any questions. If you don't want to be on camera, that's fine. Type your questions into the chat, and I'll be happy to communicate your questions to Mitch.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Joe. I know I beat you, man. You're a little slow.
Age before beauty, my friend.
I know. Hey, yeah, it is. Hey, Mitch, number one, it's good to see you and talk to you in person.
Likewise.
You've answered all my messages over the years, and I appreciate that.
I try.
You sure do. Hey, a question for you, if anything's ever occurred to you. It's kind of fascinating to me when you're just talking about Manly P. Hall hit his apex at 27. Mm-hmm. And then as a corollary, you've got the 27 club of people that hit their apex and they died.
Yeah.
You know, like and Hendrix and Joplin and Wyman and Cobain. So I found that kind of interesting from a creative energy potential.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. You know, I mean, it's a mystery to me. I certainly didn't hit my apex at that age. You know, I think at that age I had no idea what I was doing with my life. I mean, I like to point out to people, I didn't publish my first books until I was past 40. Today I'm 54. I don't think Occult America came out, I don't know, maybe I was age 43, something like that. That was my first book. And I say that just because I want people to understand that upswelling of energy is not necessarily wed to the period of time when you're young. I mean, certainly there's lots of artists, lots of great figures who do break out or find their way, when they're young. But I mean, personally speaking, I didn't find my way until what's considered midlife, in our culture. And I just want people to be aware of that. I also want people to be aware, for example, Joseph Murphy wrote his book, The Power of Your Subconscious Mind, in 1963. Power of Your Subconscious Mind is one of the most worldwide popular books of mind metaphysics. Murphy wrote that, he was about 65 years old when he wrote that book. He had been around for a long time. He had been bopping around as a metaphysical minister. He had been active since the late 1930s as a metaphysical minister, but it wasn't until age 65 that he wrote the book that finally made him famous. So, I say that not in some sentimental way, but it's absolute realism. It's absolute realism. When you discover that path, I believe it can be hugely energizing at any given point in your life.
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line of your presentation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but thank you very much.
Sure,
Appreciate
of course, yeah.
I believe, Joe, I think you had a comment.
Joe,
I did. Yeah,
Joe
absolutely. A
Martinez.
comment and not a question. Thank you so much, Mitch.
Thank you.
I've heard you speak before, man. That was probably the best encapsulation of one of my most favorite books of all time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So I just wanted to say, instead of asking you a question, I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, we actually have a couple of questions over in the chat, Mitch, if you have just a moment.
Sure, by all means.
Someone asked, did Reagan use some of Hall's work on his city on the hill concept?
It wasn't exactly the city on the hill concept, although that's an interesting one. That was certainly very central to Reagan, but primarily Reagan would talk about, he told the story over and over, which originated, for him at least, in Manly's book, Secret Destiny of America, about the presence of this unknown speaker at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And Reagan would talk about this, there being this mysterious unknown speaker who encouraged the delegates to when they were hesitating and wavering, to rush up to the front of the room and sign the Declaration. And then the unknown speaker vanished, and Manly asked the question if, was this some kind of secretive member of the, the ancient order, some member of a secret society who was, urging on the delegates at this propitious moment in history. And Reagan started including that story in his speeches at the very beginning of his political career, going back to the 1950s when he was a spokesman for GM. And then he continued to talk about it. He spoke about it at the Statue of Liberty centenary celebration during his presidency to a television audiences of millions. And I've read many of the speeches where Reagan invoked that story, and his phrasing and his ideas are a page right out of Manly Hall. I mean, it's just absolute dead to rights. I think I wrote about it for the first time in 2010. There's a piece I have in the Washington Post called Reagan and the Occult, and I did like a textual analysis, and it's just unmistakable. And then as time passed, I began to find evidence that Reagan and Hall may have met, specifically because Reagan told a certain version of the story that referenced Thomas Jefferson, and to my knowledge, Manly's the only one who had referenced Jefferson in connection with this particular story. And Reagan said, it was told to me by this man who's a great scholar of history, and I think he was making reference to Manly, and Stephen Heller confirmed that for me.
And we have one other question here on the chat. Mitch, do you think that Manly may have had Asperger's syndrome?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I guess the question is, was he a savant? Did he have some mental faculty that may have contributed to his capacity to amass these enormous amounts of information, maybe, you know, leading to a deficit in some other area like emotional connection or, you know, something of that nature. I really don't know. You know, I obviously, you know, I never met the man. You know, he passed on before my own interest in these philosophies developed. But you know, I've heard people raise questions, you know, to that effect. You know, was there some savant-like nature? I couldn't say. You know, I don't know. I mean, clearly, you know, he had an enormous capacity to function in public with great aplomb. But you know, I don't know.
Right, fantastic. And someone has asked about the primary differences and influences of Manly P. Hall and Madame Blavatsky's work. Or what do you think about the primary differences and influence between them?
Manly admired Madame Blavatsky tremendously, and he made it very clear that he regarded her as a source of great insight. Oddly, you know, if he mentions her in the Secret Teachings, it's only very, very fleeting. I'm not sure that he does at all, but he did write about her and speak about her elsewhere at other times and places. And they were different figures, you know, in a certain sense, but I think of them as belonging to the same milieu. I mean, I think the occult revival that Madame Blavatsky instigated in the late 19th century, it probably is what produced a Manly P. Hall, you know, in the sense the opening that Madame Blavatsky created allowed for the prevalence of Theosophical Society libraries, in its way indirectly spurred on the creation of these various Rosicrucian orders to which Manly attached himself. So I think that the presence of, you know, what Blavatsky established, the opening that she created in the Western world, is really, in many respects, what Manly stepped through. And I'm struck constantly by the number of things that we look upon in our world as belonging to, you know, Western variants of Eastern spirituality, or the various esoteric subcultures, or even the Wiccan revival. And these were all things that in one way or another, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, can be traced back to the openings that Blavatsky created. So I view him as a product in his way of the revolution that Blavatsky brought in spirituality.
Well, we have one other question on the chats. Could you describe your experience when you first read The Secret Teachings of All Ages? For someone who has not read it, how would you recommend approaching this book?
I would personally recommend approaching it through the reader's edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I think it's a really wonderful way to enter the book. That's an edition that I published at Torture Penguin that's still widely available. I just put tremendous effort and labor of love into it, and I think it's a good, sturdy way of entering the book. I recommend getting one of the hardback editions. You know, you can get the original edition that I was holding up is one variant, but there are other editions, other replica editions that the Philosophical Research Society publishes. Some are reduced size hardcovers. Some are reduced size paperbacks. I would get one of the reduced size hardcovers or paperbacks from the Philosophical Research Society, just for the purpose of, you really want to have the original. And I would get, you know, personally speaking, the reader's edition, because I think that will facilitate your experience, and just dive right in. Just dive right in and lose yourself in it.
And, you know, on that note, you know, speaking of hardback books, there is an autographed copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages on eBay for $1,200.
Oh,
so
boy.
If anybody is feeling, you know, exceptionally generous,
yeah,
I'll be happy to share my shipping address with you.
Okay, we're gonna crowdsource that for Matt. So,
Mitch, I do want to mention this. We were talking about, or you were mentioning Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, who I believe West passed away in 2015 or 16.
Yeah.
And what a tremendous loss he was.
Yeah.
He and
I was glad I got to know him.
Like oil and water.
Yeah, we used to live near one another, Wes and I, so I got to spend some time with him, and I really appreciated that. I did some work with Robert back in my publishing days. I published a couple of Robert's books, and I valued knowing those guys tremendously.
But it strikes me that at the age of 27, Manly seemed to embody this knowledge that was not available. It wasn't until the 90s where Schock and West and many others, Robert Bouval, Graham Hancock, all these were guys were coming out and saying, "Hey, look at this over here."
Yeah,
he said the same thing, years and decades before. It's knowledge he shouldn't have had, but now science and archaeology are really backing up some of the things that he stated.
Yeah, one of the things I write about in the Seeker's Guide is that Manly, in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, writes about the oracle at Delphi, who bore the name of Pythia. And the image that Manly presents of the oracle of Delphi is the classic image of a female medium seated on a golden tripod, and she's imbibing these fumes from a crevice in the earth, and growing intoxicated, entering a trance state, and then dispensing these prophecies. And when Manly wrote The Secret Teachings of All Ages, a lot of historians had already dismissed that image as just fanciful. Herodotus had referenced that, and it was thought to be just mythology. It was not thought to be real. But as it happens, shortly after Manly's death in 1990, there were archaeological findings at Delphi that uncovered a cave with a crevice that probably would have had vapors coming up into the open area of the cave itself, and it was the actual dead to rights image of what Herodotus had written about and what Manly affirmed in the Secret Teachings of All Ages. So back when he was writing the Secret Teachings, that image was out of favor within mainstream archaeology. It was considered myth, and after his death, archaeological findings validated it as being the actual great likelihood.
Okay, we'll do one last round.
I have a question. First, I must say it's quite humorous hearing about Manly coming up with magma.
Speak up. I'm having trouble hearing you. Sorry.
Is this better?
Give it a go.
It's quite humorous hearing about this magnum opus coming out at his young age of 27, when I myself am only 24. But the question that I have for you is a bit more practicality and engaging and studying it. Is I myself am more of a student of the sciences, currently pursuing a master's degree in genomics.
Mm-hmm.
I've found that I'm quite interested in esoteric, studying philosophy and studying some of the great works. I seem to engage with it pretty well, but I guess when I get into more branched off discussions, listening to lectures, there's just something that I don't seem to engage with. I don't seem to be able to properly incorporate the information. Or I don't know if it's something hard-coded rationalist that's been beaten into me by science teachings I've had, or what. Just wondering if you had any advice on how to better approach this study.
Well, it's interesting. I think that the things that we're experiencing in the theoretical sciences are, whether it be string theory, quantum physics, and within that world, I would include academic psychical research, suggest to us the illusory nature of time and linearity, the just enormous questions around perspective and the manner in which observation seems to be a determinant, particularly in particle physics. If one takes seriously psychical research, as I do, I write about this in several books, including my book, One Simple Idea. We have statistical evidence for some kind of anomalous transfer of information in laboratory settings. So I would say, and then of course I'm not even including fields like neuroplasticity, which demonstrate neural pathways in the brain getting altered by sustained thoughts. You know, in our generation, we have so many tantalizing and extraordinary insights into the extra-physical potentials of thought. And none of that requires us to part ways with science. And in fact, science and some of the hard sciences enhance our insights in some of these areas. So I would encourage you to look at it from that perspective, see if that's useful. I write about some of this, as alluded a moment ago in my book, One Simple Idea. I write about some of this in the Miracle Club. In fact, the Miracle Club is probably a pretty good place to consider the question between metaphysics and some of the things that we're encountering in the theoretical sciences and in psychical research. I go into that in some of the later chapters. That might be a useful bridge. But I think that the two subjects are definitely complementary. And in fact, our generation gives us a really unique vantage point to probe that.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Tonight's been a fantastic evening.
Pleasure.
And I would highly recommend picking up some, or if not all, of Mitch's books. You know, I have a few here myself. This is just a small part of my Mitch Horowitz library. You know, and I just really, it's mind-blowing work that you write. It's very inspiring. It's something that I can go back and read over and over and pick up new ideas and new concepts each time. It's they're almost like living documents. They just continue to.
Thank you.
It's not a one-time read and you're done.
Thank you.
So I highly recommend that. And Mitch, one final thing: is there anything you want to plug, or is there anything coming up on the horizon that you want everyone to know about?
Well, I have a new book out right at this moment called The Miracle Habits. I think it's a book that deals with some of the topics that we've been discussing tonight and brings them down to a very practical day-to-day level. I believe very, very strongly that spiritual ideas, esoteric ideas, should have a practical application in life, and they should be able to withstand the question, does it work? I take the question, does it work, very seriously. So The Miracle Habits is certainly a book in which I try to apply these things in a very hands-on way.
Very good. Well, again, thank you, and thank you for everyone attending.
Thank you.
It's
Pleasure.
been a phenomenal evening, and Mitch, just honestly can't thank you enough, my friend.
A pleasure. We'll do it again. I really enjoy this forum, and I want to thank everybody.
We will absolutely make it happen.
All right. Thanks very much, y'all. Good night.
Good night.
Take care.